Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. We're so glad you're joining us. I'm excited to introduce you, if you don't know him already, Doug Pagitt. Doug is a activist. He's a podcaster. He is an author. How many books have you published thus far, Doug? I was looking like over a dozen for sure.
Yeah. I think it's something like that. Maybe 11.
Something. Okay.
Yeah.
Right around a dozen. Author. I read your most recent book, I think, was Outdoing Jesus. Is that right?
Yeah. That's the last one I wrote, and maybe the last one I'll write.
Okay. All right. And then also most of his life, or a big chunk of his life, was a pastor. Yeah. Even church planter, which crosses our worlds.
Yes. Yeah. I was a church planter and a trainer of church planters. Ran a church planter boot camp and the whole thing. Yeah. Fully in that world.
So I love to start off with just people's stories, and then I want to obviously get into like maybe your most recent book and vote common good stuff. But we could back up and start kind of with Doug Pagitt's origin story, kind of get you introduced to our audience. Like, where were you born? How did you grow up? Particularly like the spirituality of your home, which, I've read, I've talked to you a bunch about that, but for our audience, let them know kind of your background.
Yeah, I grew up in a first-ring suburb of Minneapolis called Golden Valley, and grew up in an apartment complex. And for some places in the world, like being raised in an apartment is kind of normal. San Francisco, parts of Chicago, New York, that's what people do. Other parts of the country, when you grow up in an apartment complex and you live there your whole life, people think of it like apartments tend to be transitional places for people, not long time places. But I grew up in an apartment complex. My parents were managers of the apartments. Little piece of that story that might come out as we chat here about why that was, that I learned later in life about why we lived in an apartment complex and never owned a house. But so I grew up in this apartment complex in Golden Valley. I have one sister. Parents were together until my dad died, and then my mom died when I was an adult. So that's my family life. We didn't have a lot of extended family, and we had no religion at all. There was zero religious orientation. I didn't ever go to church as a kid. Never even thought we were supposed to go to church. Like some people grow up like, oh, we'd probably be at church on Sunday. Like we were never skipping church on Sunday. Like that wasn't a thing we were skipping. It was, somebody thinking they were skipping synagogue. Like, no, you weren't skipping synagogue. You weren't part of one. So I never had any religious teaching, any religious instruction. I got into Christianity as a 16-year-old and didn't know that Christmas and Easter were related to each other or really were religious holidays at all. Didn't know anything about them.
So hey, I'm curious, like, so were both of your parents, like if you go back in their genealogy, was there any faith-based stuff there, or was it like generations of atheists or just agnostic or what?
My dad grew up in a family that went to an Episcopal church in Iowa. My dad was born in 1925. His parents divorced, and he one of those people that like joined the circus and then the military probably before he was old enough to do so, kind of runaway kind of thing. So somebody gets divorced in Iowa, in the 1930s, they were excommunicated from the church.
Okay.
A lot of people who nowadays, now would think about the Episcopal Church as kind of being maybe progressive. It hasn't always been. It totally wasn't in Iowa back then. So my dad had a real sour view of religion because of that. Little pieces of that story came out. My mom was raised in a pretty broken up family and had sort of a Baptist tent revival experience with Christianity, but no real structure to it. We often joke, I often joke because I heard a guy say at a meeting with church planters, he said, nowhere in America do we know of a church planting movement that is targeting people who do their laundry in public laundromats or public spaces. And so he looked at the world through the lens of public people that do their laundry in private space versus those that do like in apartment complexes or at laundromats. He's like, that's a group of people nobody ever thinks about. Like nobody wants to start a church for a bunch of people that like have to pay for their laundry. And that was us. Like we were lower middle class. But we grew up poor. I didn't know this. My parents did the best that they could. I'll just fast forward and say when my dad died, I was 31 or 32. I learned that my dad and his brother and their uncle were in prison before I was born. And so the reason my parents ended up in Minnesota was that my mom and her sister-in-law moved to Minneapolis to be near my dad and his brother when they were in federal prison. So I didn't know any of this, but I grew up with all the implications of a parent that was a felon. And that comes with a lot of things. You can't buy a house. Jobs are hard to get. There's a lot of ways that we continue to punish felons still till this day in this country in ways that are really unfair. So anyway, I grew up in that kind of a setting. And so like religion was just not it. But we grew up in this funky little apartment complex that my parents managed. And my mom was a real soft-hearted person and did a lot to make sure that people stayed in the apartments, even though they shouldn't. When she died, a bunch of people came to her funeral. And one guy was now a professor at the University of Minnesota Medical Center. He said, when I came as an immigrant and going to medical school here, your mom let me live in the apartments for 9 months without paying rent. And then let me pay it off over the next 4 years. I never told the owner. And the owner of the apartment complex was standing right next to me. And he goes, oh, she did stuff like that all the time. Used to drive me crazy. But she created this context. It was called Village Terrace. So we all lived in the village, we call it. And it was 4 buildings, like 50 units and with a swimming pool in the middle. And there was like this thing in the 70s when we're growing up in this apartment complex. And there were all kinds of people, there were drag queens and there were a bunch of gay people there and felons that would live there. So we lived with this like real mashup of people around, and it wasn't like a religious, it wasn't your typical kind of like suburban circumstance and situation. It was like transitional people and people that were finding their way, making their way, and all the rest of it. So really, I mean, it's framed the context of what I've done with my life and how I care and who I care about.
You bet. So at 16, what happened? You went to some kind of church group or something, or got invited?
Yeah. So one of the people who lived in the apartments with me was Steve, and he lived there with his dad, and they were a tough situation kind of place. And his dad had trouble caring for him and has many of his own really deep issues. And so Steve was sent away to a foster home. Like there was child protection got involved, and Steve had to go live in a foster home for a couple of years. It's like a early teenager, moved back into the apartments when he was 15, 16. And we rekindled our friendship that we'd had before he left. And when he moved to that foster home, he became a Christian in this foster home. So he came back as this like zealous, newly converted Christian that we just tormented. There were a bunch of other people, kids our age that lived there. And he was a little on fire and we were tormenting him. And, we just did stuff together though. Like, we were best friends. And so he said one night, let's go to downtown to Minneapolis and go to see this play called The Passion Play. And I didn't know anything about it, didn't know what it was. I'm not even sure he totally knew what it was, but it was one of these Easter time plays about the life of Jesus. Right. And so if you know what a passion play is, it kind of takes just the last life. So I go into this thing knowing nothing about Jesus at all. Never heard a passage, didn't know what John 3:16 was. I recognized it from like football games, in the goalpost, but didn't know what they were. And see this story of Jesus as on the side of the downtrodden, on the side of the betrayed, on the side of the victim, turning his ire against the people in power who were using their power to suppress the weak and the poor. And then he ends up being executed and killed. I have no idea there's a resurrection coming. I don't know any of this stuff, but it's this down and in God story, right? And that God is on the side of all of these people. Mm-hmm. And that was a story. We were chatting a little earlier before about Billy Jack, but so I in one of the books I wrote called The Christianity Worth Believing, I contrast this Billy Jack story in my head, from this character from a movie, with this Jesus story that I was seeing, of kind of not turning to violence as a response to violence. Like, as a 16-year-old knowing nothing about the Christian story, I'm not infusing it with theological mumbo jumbo of the atonement or any of this like stuff that people do with Christianity. I'm just like, this is a really human story that I recognize. I know what it's like to be harmed and to be hurt and abused. And I get this, and I know these people. And yes, God is on the side of these people. Like, that's the story, right?
Yeah.
So Fred, I'm not kidding you. They do an altar call. I go down because, I'm like, yeah, I want in on this. Like, what's all that? What's up with all this? So I go down, we end up in the back of the stage, and there's all these tables or circles set up with chairs and circles. I sit in one of them. They hand out these little booklets. I think it was Steps to Peace with God or 4 Spiritual Laws or one of these, if you know what they are. Right. The guy's going through it, and I'm just like, what are we doing back here? I don't know what's up. And we get to this page that has that bridge illustration, the canyon. So like there's a sketch work, of a human being on one side and then God on the other side. Yeah. And there's a canyon there.
Right.
And honest to be, I look at this thing and I'm thinking to myself, what is this? Mm-hmm. Did you people see the story that they just did out on the stage out there? Because that story on the stage was not that there's a chasm between God and humanity. It was a story that God was on the side of humanity. Then you go backstage and they're pitching another story to you.
Were you really thinking that at 16?
Totally. I brought it up with my friend Steve on the way home. I started bringing it up the next day. I met with these discipleship people from Campus Crusade for Christ who became some really good friends. And then they wrote out a whole thing on the back of a Burger King menu and with the same kind of mumbo jumbo and a train with fact, faith, and feelings and all this stuff on it. And I'm like, none of this is like that story on the stage. I got it. I understood it. That's what I said yes to. Now you people are trying to tell me there's another story. And honestly, from that day, it feels like that has just never ended. Like, what on earth? And so, I wrote this book called Outdoing Jesus, and it's kind of that continuation of that story. I'm like, look, you can do what you want with the Bible, and there's lots of troubling things in the Bible and all that, but you just don't get to tell this other story if you want to use the Bible text for it. And people do it all the time, and it's driven me totally bonkers. And, so, I've had to construct and re-understand all the things that, have gone on. Like, well, why was Jesus crucified? And what does that have to do with anything? But you read a book like, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and you're like, okay, okay, now I see it. Now I see what an execution is. It wasn't trying to move the scales in some heavenly courtroom. It was trying to move the scales on some human courtroom. That's what's going on.
Is it a story of separation or is it a story of solidarity?
Yes. Which is it? Yeah. And I'm a both and kind of guy. So, my wife's like, it's both. It's both and. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, but that's fascinating. The 16-year-old that you picked up on that. That's really interesting. Huh.
Well, and it's framed up the way I've thought about a lot of things, the work I do now. All this, I'm like, you don't have to tell people how it is. When you're explaining philosophy and theology and all the rest of this, what you're having to do is to explain something to people that they're not otherwise going to understand. There's a view of education that is helping people to have eyes to see and ears to hear and hands to touch, right? And know what's up. And then there's a view of education, which is you're an empty vessel that doesn't know, and I need to fill you with things so that you will know. These two, self-learning versus external input. Yeah. And church is one of the places where that stuff just goes on all the time, gets drilled into you. Don't trust what you think. Let us tell you better about how this ought to go. I've been rubbing against that since I went and sat in that little circle back in the church. And the guys who discipled me, Ben and Bill and Kevin, would, they're now, I'm old and they're even older than I am. And they're like, God, you were such a pain in the ass as a teenager. Like you were just constantly questioning all this stuff. I'm like, yeah. And I wasn't questioning it because I doubted. I was questioning it because what you all are saying and what I'm reading in the story, like it doesn't make sense. Like these, and I have a master's degree in theology. I get it. Like, no problem with theology. Theology is a fun project, but it doesn't explain better than story that you can sort of read and find your way into and find these epic biblical tales of truth that are really different than theological expositions.
Yeah.
So that's a long introduction to what I'm up to now and how I got into it.
I'm one of a rabbit trail, but Matthew Fox, I think that's the right author who wrote Original Blessing.
Yeah.
A Catholic spiritual mystic kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
And, children, I think intuitively, if they have a God consciousness, feel like God loves them and is connected to them, right?
Right.
Like you got to have to train that kid to teach them that, like, oh no, you're all screwed up and God doesn't like you at all.
Yeah, no, you have to, you
have to inject shame into the story.
Yes.
Don't you think?
I do think that. And I think that we could do a whole Bible thing. I think that's part of what's going on even in the book of Genesis and with the creation narrative tales, that what they're doing is they're trying to introduce how an immature view of humanity leads people to shame and you're supposed to leave all that behind as you sort of mature. Not that things were great and then fell off the cliff and now we have to get back to another time. It's ascending narrative. Genesis is. You're sent from the garden out into the world and you're not supposed to return. So that's where the characters of, with the angels and the swords of fire are there, because they're like, you don't get to go back. There's no going back. And then someone retells the whole story with, Eden, reborn and here we go. But there's something in us that also there's this dueling thing in our humanity that wants this truth that we know, but then we really love it when someone tells us a myth that's not true. And some people are, they use myth as like the Bible's full of myth. I'm gonna tell you the hard truth. I'm like, no, you guys are just making up a bunch of stories here about God and humanity and all this stuff. Well,
myth can resonate so deeply in the spirit. Like I kind of like to say that, deep truth echoes everywhere.
Yeah.
And,
So, and you find the rhythm and the rhyme of that truth in your life. And that's what you're looking for. Like that's the thing you're trying to match. We, in our work at Salamis Porch, we used to talk about finding and living in the rhythm of God. Like, that's what we're up to as human beings, and you don't need an upgrade and you don't need an adapter.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Christian spirituality and a lot of theology is designed as the adapter to help connect two things together. It's like you got an iPhone cord and you got an Android phone and you can't hook them together and you're trying to figure out how, and someone then comes up with some snappy little adapter to make that thing fit. You shouldn't need all that stuff. There's a way of humanity. And certainly if you're in the Jesus story, as I like to find myself, you totally don't need an adapter in there. I mean, Jesus is like, you've heard it said, but that stuff, I tell you, there's a better way to go than that. And Jesus loved to flip that stuff around and,
Definitely a radical, revolutionary Torah teacher, not a fundamental conservative Torah teacher.
Totally. Like he looks and says, the Torah is called the Torah. We get the word torch from it, is the light. In fact, the Torah is the light of the world. And then Jesus looks at this group of people on a hillside and says, and you know what else? You're the light of the world, which to a Jew is saying that Torah and humans are at the same level of value, like the closest thing to God. And nowadays people are like, well, you as a person, you shouldn't tell me anything. Only the scripture should, and you're like, but aren't I the light of the world? Isn't like we just take all that Jesus stuff and just pat it all down, give it very little meaning at all. and then ask ourselves, how come this doesn't feel very interesting to me anymore? And that's really the problem. A lot of people they didn't stop believing Christianity. They just stopped finding it interesting.
So let's pause it at because I want to circle back to the outdoing Jesus and some of this theology. Sure. But I want to go back up a little bit, get a little bit more of your story, your history. So from a teenager who was, comes to Jesus, but precocious and full of questions and all that kind of stuff, hard to disciple. But through all of that, you felt a call to pastor, evidently, right? And you got into, how did you get into pastoring? And then let's give a little bit of framework for the emergent church movement that you work with.
Yeah. It's all tied together. So like that experience I had when I'm sitting in that theater watching this play, and I'm like, you people all know this already? Later I realized that they saw a story and then had it retold to them that made it less compelling. But at the time I thought, hey, this is really good news. Why don't I know this already? Right. And then I start finding out about all these other people that are Christian. Like I go to my school and I meet these other Christians, I meet these other people. And I remember talking to my friend Anne, and I'm like, Anne, like she goes to church and stuff. And like, I knew people went to church. I just didn't know it was a thing I was supposed to do. And I'm like, how come you never talked to me about this? And she said, well, I just didn't think you were somebody that was kind of interested. Like, I've known you since kindergarten, and I don't know, maybe I wasn't, but like, seriously. And so I had this sense that there was this group of left out, left behind, and let down people. And that there's this story of God with those people. And a lot of folks just don't know that. And the way religion is and everything, they're getting the circle of chairs conversation, not what's going on the scene. So this starts to become really important to me. That kind of temperament and personality, the story itself, just all kinds of things are kind of mixing together. So I become sort of an evangelist like my friend Steve was, at the time. I got suspended from high school for trying to hand out Christian literature, and was told that was against school rules, which caused me to then file a federal lawsuit against my school. And so like, I'm an advocate and I'm doing stuff. And I played, I was a basketball player and I was a high caliber basketball player and went to a camp for best players in Minnesota that was held at this Christian college. Found out there were Christian colleges, and ended up going to one of those colleges called Bethel College to play basketball. And just learning about, I was a Christian for it was my junior year that I got into all this stuff. So kind of through my senior year, and then went to college.
NAIA school.
It was an NCAA school. Yeah.
Oh, NCAA. Division 2? Division
3. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
In Minnesota, there's this really high level of Division 3 basketball in Minnesota. Plays a really, really great level.
My dad was a college basketball player in Kansas, and then not a KU, but at a small college. But yeah. So I grew up loving basketball. And then nephew that ended up being All-American NAIA at Mid-American Nazarene,
Okay, yeah, that's good school. Yeah, that's good basketball school.
They, led the league in rebound scoring, all that. Anyway.
So that was, I was in that world. So I was like interested in Christianity, interested in basketball, went to this college, didn't know anything about it. I had terrible grades. I had to get in on academic probation to go to college. And cause I didn't read books at home. We just didn't do stuff like that. And, it was fun. So I went to college and kind of made my way and found out that if you were a member of a church in that school's denomination, you got some amount of money, $350 or $500 a year as a scholarship. So I was looking down the list of all the scholarships available, and that was one of them.
What was the denomination?
It's called the Baptist General Conference, which is like the Evangelical Free Church conference. So it's like these not Southern Baptist, not conservative Baptist, but Swedish Baptist.
You go to
so I looked at Baptist General Conference in the phone book, found a church by my house. It turned out to be this church near a golf course that I played golf at when I was a kid. So I knew the general area, drove there as a sophomore in college and went to a church service, filled out a card and said, I need to become a member because I needed that scholarship, and met with the staff. And it was a then it was a big church. It ultimately became a much, much bigger church called Wooddale Church, and started working in the youth ministry there as a volunteer. And, I'm the kind of guy, when you're a college basketball player at a Christian college nearby in the denomination, and you come in, you want to work with high school kids, and you're 2 years out of high school. It's a pretty good scene for a youth leader. And then became the youth pastor there and stayed there for 12 years and worked in this big mega church. And
yeah.
But even there, it was a very open and free kind of space. Like, for people who think that evangelicalism is what it is now, that it's taken over by the Jerry Falwells and Jerry Falwell Juniors of the world and the Trumpists and the charismatic Pentecostal wackadoodles and all that stuff. Like, it wasn't always like that. There was a period in the 1980s when evangelicals were not only culture warriors and were not. And I didn't know how conservative it was on some issues. Nobody sort of messed with me. Like, I grew up in this space, with the kinds of people I was describing in the apartment complex. And, you get a lot of pass when you're a new convert and sort of good at what you do. So anyway, it was a great experience. Had a great time working at that church. And so
I want to maybe hit that point just real quickly again, because, I just had interviewed Frank Schaefer Jr. a little while ago, and he's careful to point out that the instincts of his dad, and loving hanging out with the hippies and loving, and they accepted the gays, they accepted the dope, they accepted everybody, and loved people through, Jesus in L'Abri, which was, for those who missed my interview with Frank, you should go back and listen to that, But then what it turned into, Frank says probably his dad wasn't nearly as excited about where it went, right, after it kind of got out of his control. And even in the beginning days of the vineyard, the hippie thing, people coming to Jesus, I wanted to reach the people outside the church with a with a radical grace-based message. And I always welcome Democrats and Republicans. And I think the polling data now shows that evangelical in American minds today, at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, is not what I signed on with in the late 70s as what an evangelical meant to me. Now it actually means Trump follower. Yeah. And that's what it's, because you've got all of these people who actually probably didn't go to church, but now they love Trump and now they call themselves evangelicals.
Yeah. If you take a 20-year period from, say, September 11th till now, so some of us can think about 20 years and it doesn't feel as long, you're like, the attacks on the United States on September 11th was 21 years ago, right? So if you take a 20-year period of time, from 1975 to 1995, which is a long time, but it's, get your arms around it. The fundamentalist takeover of evangelicalism, the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist was, I don't know if you've done your history on all that, but it was. I
was one, dude. I was sitting at the table with the conservatives.
Okay,
I was too young. I was too young, but I was going to the school I went to Baylor.
Okay, there you go. Then you know what's going on at Southwest and it.
I went to Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary. Yeah, I graduated from Baylor. But Baylor,
name the names of the people who did it. Like, this stuff didn't just happen. People did it. The crime scene has DNA all over it.
Right. I had super liberal professors at Baylor, classic liberal. And then my professors at Southwestern in the 80s were very moderate. None of them were inerrant,
Totally.
And I was going to Baylor and Southwestern and knew the people who were leading the conservative takeover.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that conservative takeover is clear there. It happened in charismatic Pentecostal movements, including the Vineyard and the Calvary Church movement. And it happened in the more non-denominational evangelical spaces. And a whole lot of really good people, some of them are my friends, just stepped away and let the conservatives have it. And I've chosen not to do that. And as best I can, just one guy. I feel like that episode on Gilligan's Island, where they run into the World War II guy that didn't know the war was over. That one where they make the little story about the guys found on the island, and like just holding out, just trying to be like, maybe there's a possibility that the conservatives and fundamentalists won't take over all of Christianity and burn it to the ground. And so now I claim myself to be a progressive evangelical, but back in the 80s, I would have just been an evangelical. Like these are people that wouldn't let C.S. Lewis in. They probably wouldn't let John Stott in, guys who I think are far too conservative. But anyway, even guys like that couldn't make it into this into this world. So that whole thing, I watched it happen. I saw it happen. It drove me crazy watching it happen and watching good people go quiet. And then, you just fast forward up to the 2016. You're like, well, yeah, of course, these people gave up the fight long ago and turned it over to, a Trumpist movement. So I heard somebody say, I think it's somebody who was from that world and has kind of resisted it, but he said, we used to worry that people wouldn't believe the story of Jesus we were telling them. Now people don't think we believe the story of Jesus that we're telling them. And that's a great flip. That's a doozy. I like that one.
I want you to share a little bit about, you went from Wooddale, youth pastor there for 12 years, but the emergent church movement. Yeah. What was that about? For just share it with people who might not know. And I have a little joke that I told you when we had a Zoom meeting together about, I tried to, when you first started that Leadership Next thing, I tried to get in on it.
Yeah, you were too old.
I was too old. I was 40. I think my birthday was 2 years too old. Like I was born in 61.
Yeah.
And so my joke was, man, Doug, if you hadn't turned me away, you might have saved me. I don't know.
Saved my soul.
Yeah. So what is that thing about? Because it got my attention. Sounded interesting to me when I was 40 pastoring Vineyard Church in Kansas City, Missouri,
Well, my apologies. That was a mistake on our end. Sorry about that. Sorry the way things have gone for you. All right. So here's what's up. A lot of us were youth pastors, and I was a youth pastor, and we were bringing together people from the large churches. When you work in a big church where there's like multiple staff, 10 or 20 or 30 people, and you have hundreds of kids in your youth ministry and all this stuff, it's just a different setting than it is for people that are in other kinds of churches. So there was networks of people from big churches. And I worked ultimately where I went to work for a group that organized these kinds of big churches called Leadership Network. But I first knew about that group because there was I helped form a network of youth pastors from big churches. So we were doing this kind of work at that time. And we're talking like in the early 1990s, maybe late 1980s, there was a lot of conversation about generationalism, which I thought was nonsense then, and more convinced that generationalism is nonsense now. But there was a lot of talk about Gen X. What does it mean for Gen X people? And what's this next generation after the baby boomers? What's it going to look like? And, kids that grew up with latchkey and saw the shuttle blow up and, all the David Letterman instead of Johnny Carson, all the nonsense of generationalism, right? So, but there was a lot of focus on this. And some of us were saying, look, yeah, there's generation, and I'm part of the Gen X generation. Fred, you're really close to it. You can see the Gen X generation from where you are, But we also were saying, look, there's something more going on. There's a larger shift in the world. There's a larger cultural shift. There's a larger philosophical shift that goes by a lot of names, including postmodernism. So we're moving from a period of modernity into a period of postmodernity, and Gen X is one of those. But the generationalism is like the waves coming up on the beach, but cultural shifts are like the undertow that's going back out in the ocean. It's actually what's causing the waves, right? And that greater power and that greater pull by the moon, that kind of stuff. That's what we really want to talk about. So a lot of us were super interested in both generationalism as it helped us to understand postmodern culture. And is there a larger shift in society that's moving us beyond modernism and colonialism and a whole lot of other isms that we think are a problem, maybe even capitalism, right? So this is the kind of stuff we were all talking about as youth pastors. We weren't just doing fun games. We were talking about theology. Like, how do you live in a postmodern age when so much of your theology was created in a pre and modern age period of time? right? So this kind of stuff. And what does a postmodern theology look like? And what would postmodern churches look like and all this? So we're doing that kind of work. That then led to a whole series of meetings around what does it mean to reach Gen X people? And every generation is interesting to marketers and to church people because it's the young generation. So give it whatever letter you want. Someone's going to be interested in 19 to 25 year olds, right? So we were talking about that group of people. That ultimately led to forming this new outreach effort to find the best leaders in America reaching Gen X culture and younger. So that's what I was hired to do, is travel the country, create context, create a system and a structure with the funding of this nonprofit or this private foundation that could find the next great group of leaders. So, find, guys like Rob Bell and Erwin McManus and Tim Keller and Pam Fickencher and Daniel Schroyer, and like men and women of doing all kinds of interesting stuff all over the country, and started creating a network of those people. And so I did that for a whole period of time between being at Wooddale and starting the church that ultimately was a pastor of called Solomon's Porch. And so I was creating that network and finding those people and creating conferences. And ultimately that we found a name and a context for that we called the emerging church or emergent village. And we used emergent to reference emergent principles and emergent properties and forestry and emergent growth and all this kind of, sciencey philosophical stuff about emerging culture that's not driven from one center point, but it's going to happen in a variety of places simultaneously. So anyway, that's what we were doing. And then that produced a whole network of emerging church stuff, of which one of the premier conferences that we first launched to kind of introduce this stuff to the country at large was a conference where we said, if you were born born before 1965, you could come to this conference, but you had to come as the guest of someone born after 1965. So older generation needed to be the guest and live like the guest and function like the guest. This is our big, thing is when you're 30-year-old, like you 40 and 50-year-olds can come, but you got to come with a 22-year-old that's going to be they're the host. They're the real invitee and you're the guest. So live like it and learn like it and all the rest of that stuff. So, it's a marketing pitch. And we had to pick a year. Had I met you, I probably would have picked 1961 just to let you know. But we just picked 1965 because that's what the generationalism said. Yeah. Said the rules were.
Well, so what bring us up to like what happened with that movement, and then kind of bring us up to where you're at now. And but I want to have a little bit of time to talk about outdoing Jesus, a couple of theology points there.
Sure.
And then I want to have time to talk some about Vote Common Good.
Yeah, for anywhere between 10 and 20 years, this emerging church thing was alive and well, had a lot of energy, had a lot of interest to it. People from many different, I came from an evangelical background. People from lots of different denominations were interested in it. They were making their own little hybrid versions, like what does emerging culture look like for Methodists? So they started a thing called Meth-emergent and Presby-emergent for Presbyterians and Luther-emergent. And like there were just, what does it mean to be in a context and then emerge to the next thing, right? So that's the thing that we were doing and we're up to. And it's, the impact of it is still around. It was never it was an approach to the world, not a product that we were trying to sell. A lot of people still don't understand that. Like, well, what's the theology of the emerging movement, emerging church? We're like, well, it depends on what your context is. What are you emerging from? And like, where, if you're an emerging charismatic, it's really different than if you're an emerging Calvinist. Like you're starting from different places, and the other people's thing is probably more refreshing than your own thing. And you might be swapping recipes, and it was an approach to the world that began with openness and began with understanding, conversation, and friendship. So we had this thing called, being a friend of emerging. And then so Facebook comes along in 2006 or whatever, and we're doing this stuff in 2001 and 2 and 3. And, we were right in that vibe, right? Like organize people under the banner of friendship and conversation. So when Facebook launches and they're called friends and you're going to then exchange things in a social posts, we're like, yeah, that's the stuff we think we should be doing too. Like it kind of made sense. It was all built out of that same milieu of thinking and thought. And could you have, is the approach to spirituality the thing you're really trying to curate, as opposed to the spiritual artifacts or the spiritual answers or even the spiritual questions? Like it's certainly not about answers. It's probably not even about questions. It's probably about an approach or a way of being.
Yeah. 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 So, and then that, in terms of a movement, has kind of just diversified. And what year did Wild Goose Festival start? Because I went to that last year for the first time, or I went to that in July this year.
I think it's 10 years ago that Wild Goose Festival started. Is that right? Didn't they just have the 10th anniversary? I've been to all of them except last year's. So I think it was 10 years ago.
That was the first one I went to. So it was interesting. I enjoyed it, but that was something that kind of came out of that as an ongoing.
Yeah, there were lots of things that came out of it. Like, there were many relationships and people and events and publishers and churches, like lots of stuff came out of that approach. Yeah, it's totally in that same approach, same swath. Yeah. Right.
So your book, Outdoing Jesus, is really a kind of a commentary on the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. And, when I was reading, I was thinking, if you think about sort of the evangelical take on the Gospel of John, probably one of the most often quoted passages from John's Gospel is John 14:6. Mm-hmm. Jesus saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." Mm-hmm. And then that gets interpreted through a very exclusive lens. Mm-hmm. Like Jesus is the I am statements. He's saying he's deity, he's God in the flesh. And then like, if you don't believe in me, basically you're going to hell.
Yeah.
And so and you might even throw a good C.S. Lewis argument in there, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, to really bring it home.
Right.
And your book kind of, and you have a previous book called Flipped, but your Outdoing Jesus book kind of flips that on its head a little bit, right?
Yeah. I mean, it tries to take the passages more on face value.
And you're also trying to integrate it into the Exodus story, the I am Exodus story.
Yeah.
And how the 7 miraculous signs tie into the 7 days of creation, and how the creation story pops up in.
Yeah, it's pretty clever, isn't it? When you saw that, you're like, hey, there's a turn phrase.
Yeah, and how the I am really is just Jesus echoing the people back to the Exodus story.
Yeah.
More so than some personal identity thing. And
if I could have my way, rather than people picking from John, like the phrase either "for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten Son," or "I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me." There's another great phrase in John, which a lot of people know, which is, "Those who believe in me will do the works that I'm doing and do even greater works than these." And that's the frame of this book.
Yeah.
That's where the term "greater than" comes from, because Jesus says they'll do greater works than these. And the works he's describing specifically are the 7 miraculous signs in the Gospel of John. And there's only 7 in John. They're structured in a certain way. The 7 that are in John are not in the other Gospels, or if they sound like ones from the other Gospels, they have such a major difference in them that they are fundamentally a different story. Mm-hmm. So you have 7 miraculous signs that don't show up in the other Gospels that mirror and match the 7 days of creation, because what Gospel of John is trying to propose is that Jesus is the Son of Man and the new Adam who's calling for a new way of humanity. And what will that humanity look like? And these 7 miraculous signs show us what that new humanity would look like. So I take modern and science and cultural developments and say, this is how that miraculous sign, changing water to wine or healing a blind person or, healing a boy that was going to die of a fever, how people are doing and outdoing those things now, and that the greater than promise that Jesus talked about is constantly being fulfilled, because Jesus is the great starting line, not the great finish line. That Jesus is not the miraculous exception, but the magnificent rule for how humanity is supposed to live and supposed to be. So it's totally a different way to read the Gospel of John. I think it's more faithful to the Gospel of John than what people do when they hunt and pick and try to figure out these miraculous signs and all the rest of it. And I mean, I could tell you stories about how I got turned on to this idea and all the rest of it, but that's the argument of the book. It's fundamentally interested in Jesus as the Son of Man, which is the phrase he gives to himself in the Gospel of John. So in other words, he's, Adamson. So it's the new Adam. And we just immediately replace everything in the Gospel of John by turning him into the Son of God instead of the Son of Man. And there's no meaning to Son of God, if not the Son of Man. But for most people, they want to see Jesus as an exception, who's a child of God and not human like the rest of us. Maybe theologically, they'd have to sign off, fully God, fully man, but they don't mean it at all. They really mean that he did all that stuff because he had magic power or superhero power or something else.
So what's funny is, I was in the Vineyard movement. We weren't cessationists. And John Wimber, who was very influential in the Wimber movement, this was one of his favorite verses, but he sprung board off of it saying, well, all of us Christians, the authority in the name of Jesus, can do signs and wonders like Jesus did, so we're praying for the sick and we're trying to duplicate the miraculous things as followers of Jesus with his authority and power and all that kind of stuff. And, and so, I've prayed for sick people my whole life. Can't even tell you how many. And I always tease, here I was a vineyard pastor and my church ended up being one of the larger vineyards in the world. And I always say, I don't have the gift of healing. You better go to somebody else because I'll pray for you. But
it doesn't work. Go see the people over at Mount Sinai Hospital. They probably could help with that.
I think they end up feeling loved by me because I prayed for them, and I prayed for them in a gracious way. But occasionally something crazy good would happen. And it seemed like it was a result of the prayer. But I love the way you expanded this into, I love two things about your book. One, that the way you're interpreting John, which I thought you did great historical work on it too, by the way. So good job. And, but one, it becomes a way more inclusive story for all of humanity to participate in this new humanity that Jesus, through the new creation, is trying to bring about. And then you give access point. You don't have to go work out you don't have to go do a supernatural miracle, but you can go feed somebody. You can go, scientists can help people get a prosthetic and help people walk, and people can, clean water. And I mean, you gave hundreds of examples of how we can take the deep meaning of these texts and move them into humanity, loving, embracing each other versus hating and dividing into tribalism and trying to kill each other. It's a beautiful new humanity that you showed that as Jesus showing a pathway forward that works even in the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's what I wanted to do. I mean, it was a project for me trying to, in my book Flipped and in Greater Than, they're really two, they go together. They're a little pair. And so is Christianity Worth Believing. There's a little trifecta of books, these three, because in Christianity Worth Believing, when I finished writing that, I was like, I think I've done a sufficient and helpful job of a non-exclusivist Christianity that's for the left out, the left behind, the let down in us all. But I really still had a problem in my own theology that I felt like I hadn't really dealt with. But what does Jesus have to do with any of this? Right? Which, if you're going to be Christian, and I want to be Christian, and I want to be Christian in a Jesus-y way, you kind of got to figure out what Jesus's role in all this is, right? Like that's a major thing. So in Flipped, I kind of moved that direction. And then in Greater Than is sort of the finishing of the Jesus. I'm really, like everybody in their own stories, I am trying to answer the 35 years of questions that came out of me sitting in the front of that balcony of that church, watching that play on the stage. What happened there? And I've been trying to keep, I want to keep in that story to see, does that story actually make sense as a pathway for humanity to live? Because I'm just not religious enough to actually think I need a cosplay circumstance in my life where I'm going to go pretend to be somebody else. I'm not a sports fan. I don't need to get dressed up on Sundays and cheer for my football team. And I don't do live action role play, and I don't need to go to cosplay, and I don't need to go to church and pretend there's another kingdom of God somewhere that we're going to talk about while we're here that has nothing to do with what's outside the windows. So I wanted I wanted a story of my religion that compelled me into humanity in a way that was good for me, and ultimately I thought was good for everybody, and that everyone was going to have enough and no one had to be afraid. So if you don't get there, what's the point of your religion if it's not a benefit and blessing for others? So I've been trying to noodle around with this and figure it out. And the Gospel of John was the thing I read that those guys that were really good to me and discipled me into Christianity told me to read the Gospel of John. I did. I remember the first time I read that phrase. Those would do great. And I remember someone explaining to me that, it means you can do miracles like Jesus did. And I'm like with magic power. Like, I don't think Jesus was doing, because even at the time, I write this in the book, even at the time when I first read the miraculous signs, they're not that miraculous. All in all, water to wine, healing a kid of a virus, a guy at a pool that then thinking later, they're kind of miraculous, but not really by the standards of what goes on at any research university hospital. Like, they're just not that impressive. So what are these miracles doing here? He never flew. He didn't invent the zipper 2,000 years ahead of time, which he should have, because the zipper is an amazing, miraculous thing. So clearly these stories are not superhero stories. I think my little bit in there about superheroes is kind of the thing I really wanted to write over a whole book just to sit that thing in there. Right. But if we don't get beyond Jesus as a superhero character with magic powers, then we're really going to get stuck in a Christianity that makes no sense. Wow. Because it just doesn't make any sense to long for a time when there was a really great magician with God magic, and now you just have a little bit of it. So he had all of it, and you get one gift or something that you could maybe do 1/3 of the time. This is not a compelling story for humanity. There's a better one, and it's in the Gospels. And so the Gospel of John is not that little story. It's not an exclusive story. It's this big, beautiful, broad way of everlasting life, which doesn't mean that life, you just live forever. It means you're on a path that has no end. It's a path of human flourishing and human goodness. And, I start sounding like a humanist or something when I'm reading the thing, but I'm nowhere near as humanist as Jesus is. There's nobody more humanist than that guy. That guy was really believed in humanity.
Yeah. Well, I think
sorry about the sermon there.
Yeah. I encourage people to read it. I think it's got some wonderful insight and a lot of ways to participate in this new creation, new humanity that Jesus modeled for us. So vote common good. So let me I came to Jesus. I was smoking weed at 14, 15, 16. My dad made me go to a Southern Baptist youth camp, get saved, feel 2 months later called to be a pastor. And I am, registering to vote for the first time as an 18-year-old. Ronald Reagan's run in 1980, and I'm Southern Baptist, saved, not doing drugs anymore, feel called to be a pastor. I register as a Republican, and basically I would still be a registered Republican. Right. And I kind of, got into the Republican pro-life platform, started a, charismatic light evangelical church. Mm-hmm. I wasn't one of the super charismatic vineyards out there, but always had, I had Democrats on my board. I had Democrats on my staff. I didn't try to alienate Democrats. There were some things in the Democratic platform that I actually agreed with, like universal health care. And I was always pro-immigrant and, a lot of, because I looked at some of the social justice things that the prophets and Jesus talked about and, valued some of those things, still would have felt like life was sacred. When 2000 and, when 9/11 happened, I was right out of the gates 2 weeks in, I was talking about loving Muslims.
Yeah.
And, not trying to create an enemy out of them. And so there were some good things. And then, when Bush got into the Iraq war, I wasn't for that, and then And then all of a sudden, we're humming along. Probably when Obama ran, my congregation probably split in half. I bet you we canceled each other votes out. A few thousand people voted for one guy, a few thousand people voted. Most of my younger people voted for Obama,
Yep.
And then Trump comes along. This is before I went to rehab in 2018. And I voted for John Kasich in the Republican primaries in 2016.
Yeah. A lot of people tried to.
I was never a Trump fan. And as I watch this unfold, it's like, my joke is with all my Republican friends is like, yeah, Trump turned me into a Democrat. It's like, right. but I mean, so many of my friends still vote, even if they don't like Trump, they voted for Trump largely only because of the pro-life platform, right? So you're out there, started Vote Common Good. Your instincts on starting this was to help some of our evangelical friends to maybe who are questioning Trump. Did you start it specifically because of Trump?
Yeah. Specifically because of the evangelical support of Donald Trump. That's what caused us to create the organization.
Yeah. And so you started that trying to help maybe persuade some faith-based evangelical supporters that it would be okay if they actually voted for a Democrat.
Yeah.
For any number of reasons, but typically started it because of the Trump stuff, right?
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah. So give us a few minutes on Vote Common Good and what you're trying to do through Vote Common Good. And if anybody's interested, how they can access.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways you could think, well, how did this guy's life pivot from that thing? I wrote that book in 2018 that we were just talking about. How'd you end up also doing this? And it feels to me very, very similar because there's this, remember, I felt like there was this good news of the gospel that was being held back from people and other people weren't hearing about it. And I felt like I was one of those and wanted out. So I knew that the system and structures of religion often make things harder on people rather than easier. Not always, but they can tend to do so. And I knew so many people who were like your story that were just like, I have an identity that some point became wedded together where my religious identity and my political identity are that I'm a Christian, so I'm a Republican. Like the joke is like they went to the Wendy's drive-through and ordered the number 2. It came with the fries, and they said, "I won't eat the fries this time." They ate the fries, right? The Republican identity came along with the deal, and they just didn't know any different. And then over the last 25, 30 years, people have been told repeatedly that Democrats are godless and that Republicans are holy and, all this stuff. And so people end up believing this stuff. Then their eyes get opened up and they're like, okay, hang on a minute. I thought we were doing this. And then you go with this guy. And now you're telling me that none of this stuff, that thing that happened to people. But we knew that there were a lot of people who felt really alone, didn't know what to do, felt conflicted. And we wanted to put forth a Christian evangelical voice that said, you don't have to vote for the guy. Don't let them bully you into it. Fred, you're unique in the world that you were in, that you didn't put a lot of pressure on people to come down one way or the other. But there's a lot of social pressure when it comes to voting, and religion's one of the places that delivers that social pressure. And for a lot of evangelicals, that pressure is you vote for a Republican or you're not a good Christian. And we wanted to help people realize you can have the common good as your voting criteria, not republicanism. And if you can, in good conscience, vote for Republican, vote for Republican. Great. But you don't have to. And just breaking that thing open, just saying you can swap out the fries for a side salad. Oh, I can swap the fry. Like when you're at a place and they're like, you can make substitutions. You're like, oh, I'll have the salad instead of the fries. And sometimes on a menu, it says no substitutions. There's a lot of people whose evangelicalism tells them no substitutions. We're like, just try the salad this time, right? Keep your faith. But what a lot of Democrats say to people is, hey, if you want to vote for a Democrat, give up your evangelical identity. So we knew that I don't really care who someone votes for. I care about who's elected, but I'm not running around trying to make sure people vote for the right person because their voting needs to make them a good person. I think we should separate our voting practice from our personal identities as best we can, or at least recognize when we can. It's what in psychological terms they call agency, right? You should have more agency. You can choose to do something or not. So, a psychologist might tell somebody who says to her, they might say, well, he just made me so mad. The therapist might say, well, you responded in anger, but he maybe didn't make you. You have agency. You have other choices available to you. That agency is really empowering. So that's what we wanted. We're not trying to convince people to change their minds. Our joke is, look, Donald Trump is a self-cleaning oven. The guy does all the work for you. He'll show you how bad he is. The question is not how bad is he? The question is how good are you? Right? So can you separate? So that's the kind of work we're doing. And this is what, as a pastor, I've realized you do as a pastor, right? You say to people like, hey, I'm not going to tell you to change your beliefs, but if you have a belief that's not serving you well, just know there's a possibility you could let go of that. You might not have to hold that belief later. Now, we also recognize for a lot of people, our beliefs are not something we choose. They happen to us. They visit us. They haunt us. So we have to help people with skills and resources and personal capacities. I heard a definition of leadership that I really liked, actually by the guy who was the founder of the Wild Goose Festival. Gareth Higgins sent me onto this. It's quoting somebody else, but I heard it from Gareth. The quote is that the primary goal of leadership is to create the conditions by which people can become emotionally mature. The goal of leadership is to create the conditions by which people can become emotionally mature. Yeah. I like that so much, right? I like everything about it. Well, can you create the conditions by which people could say, hey, I can do something I didn't have to, but I also know just how hard that is. And I actually truly believed and still believe that Donald Trump is a unique threat to the well-being of this country, this planet, and everyone who lives on it. I think that he is a threat to democracy. I think he's a threat to civility. I think his policies are a threat to goodness and to immigrants and to economics and to environmentalism. And I think it's really a problem. And I cannot imagine anybody else at any point in time ever being elected president that I would have said, I'm going to pivot my life and spend my time trying to move 5 to 10% of evangelicals in certain voting situations to not vote for somebody. Like, who gives up their life to do that? Well, I was convinced that was that I just like that level of cataclysmic belief in how dangerous this guy is and how bad it is, to a point that it actually kind of shocks me. So anyway, we started this organization. That's what we do. We travel. We do stuff. We do a lot of media. We do a lot of, I'm on lots of news programs and news articles, and we spend a lot of time in the press, and we spend a lot of time producing content, really worried about Christian nationalism, really worried about immigration, really worried about violence, civil violence that's supported by the death penalty and other kinds of things. So anyway, there's particular topics we spend a lot of energy around, but we're really trying to help voters just have a personal identity where their religion and there is a choice, just a greater level of autonomy, a greater level of agency, a greater level of choice is what we're gunning for.
It's interesting. I started partnering in Kansas City years ago, with we kind of did you ever meet Steve Sjogren?
Oh yeah, I know Steve very well. Yeah. Steve was a big player in that group that I worked for.
He's a really dear friend of mine since the 90s. Same with Carl Medeiros, if you know Carl.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. Uh-huh.
But anyway, they're two of my longtime vineyard friends from the 90s. Yep. Still connected to both of them. But, we really did our social justice platform through Steve's kind of God's love in practical ways, no strings attached. So I didn't really do it politically so much as I did it just servant wise, try to serve the city and all of its places that, are broken or need help and so I partnered heavily with the Latino and African-American churches in Kansas City, and still some of my closest friends. And it was so interesting because like all of my African-American friends, even if they were very conservative theologically, voted Democrat, right? Yeah. It was always, like as a white evangelical guy in the suburbs, when I first started initially hanging out with my African-American pastor friends, I was like, well, how can you guys be, and this was 25 years ago. How can you guys be for Democrats? They're not pro-life, whatever. And so through, like untold hours of discussions, and then of course my European friends, even my vineyard European friends were like, what's wrong with you, pro-life? They never saw it the way so many white evangelicals saw it in the 80s and 90s even. The European evangelicals were seeing our political totally different.
Totally.
So that helped me to rethink everything even back then, 25, 30 years ago, because I started listening long enough to my friends outside of America and my African-American and Latino friends in America. Even though the Latino vote's a little mixed, the African-American vote, not so much. Like, 98% of Black women vote for, Hillary or voted for, anyway. So, so that kind of helped me. So then, like, seeing what you're doing in the Trump era makes total sense to me. Mm-hmm. But there's so many of my evangelical friends who still can't see it that way. You know what I mean? I know you do.
Yeah. It's my daily reality.
And it's like,
I'm a guy that talks about religion and politics. It's what a party pooper.
How can you be a real follower of Jesus and vote for
Trump? I don't know how it's possible, but some people do it. I know real Christians who vote for Trump. It's true. I've met them. I know them. They're sincere in their faith, and they do that thing. It's amazing.
Yeah. And I had people in my church that were Democrats for years that said that, like, we're so glad we found a church where you can spot, but we can vote Democrat, and I'm like, it's okay. I believe you're a follower of Jesus, and I value you. I'm glad you're here, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Oh, what a world we live in. What a world. So,
and and look, I know a lot of pastors who think the church should just stay out of it. And I know a lot of people, a lot of Democrats I hang around with are like, religion should have nothing to do with it. But the truth of it is, for most people, they're one human being who has faith, experiences, leanings, interests, practices, and they're the same person that does these other things in their life. So you can't separate them in the person. You should separate them from the government. Jeff Sessions, as the Attorney General of the United States, should not describe the insanity of family separation policy by saying, I want to commend to you the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 13. That's Christian nationalism, which he did. Donald Trump should not clear a bunch of protesters out so he can go stand in front of St. John's Church and hold up a Bible. You shouldn't do that. Yes, that stuff we shouldn't be doing. I think we shouldn't have chaplains opening our sessions of the Senate with prayer. I think there's any role in it. I think we should. But an individual person, you're not going to separate, you're not going to separate from a person. That person's going to be motivated. And that's where we work. We work in that space with the person, not in those other spaces. We don't really work on policy per se. We work on voters, and we work to help candidates introduce themselves to voters in a way that the voter could make an exception to maybe for one time vote for not Republican and to have a choice. So that's the kind of work we do, really designed to help people do what they already want to do. Like I said, we're not trying to change minds. We're trying to help people act in a way that would be more consistent with the change that they've already experienced.
Yeah. Well, one thing that helped me out too was when I was at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, I loved history. I studied ancient Near Eastern history, but then I studied church history. And one of my favorite professors was a guy named William Estep, who was one of the top experts in Anabaptist history. He'd written the Anabaptist story. He'd translated the Schleitheim Confessions. I mean, these are the people who were in the Reformation. They got killed by everybody. They were the pacifists. They took Jesus seriously about loving your enemies. They didn't pick up arms. They totally separated themselves from the state because they saw the state as corrupt. They didn't even think a Christian should serve in the state or hold arms for any purpose whatsoever. So that's why they ended up becoming like the Mennonites and the Amish and all that. They were kind of separatists, but their instincts for taking Jesus seriously when it came around church state issues and when it came around pacifism have always been my leaning ever since I studied those guys. I was reading Politics of Jesus by John Howard Yoder when I was
totally.
and rethinking all of that stuff. And I just don't think a lot of evangelicals realize, like, when Christians have been in power, political power throughout the 2,000 years of Christianity, we've done a pretty shitty job.
Yeah.
In fact, we've done most everything about the opposite of what Jesus would have done.
Right.
And the Christians in the minority, persecuted, have always looked a whole lot more like Jesus than Christians in power.
Yeah.
You know? And so
we have this narrative where in America where you're the hero, the villain, or the victim, and you're always one of those three. It's really, really hard. It's damaging to us as a society. And so people will find a way for them to be the hero every time, or at least the victim. And that's what you get in this Christian movement, is some victimized Christian narrative where Christians are being persecuted in some way because they have to bake cakes for weddings they don't want to bake, don't want to attend. And where they're the hero, just protecting the babies, just saving the babies. What about the babies? I mean, the number of times I've heard people yell at me, "What about the babies?" And I'm like, well, if you really care about the babies, maybe you spend a little time at a pro-life clinic. Do you give any money to a pro-life? You don't do anything. So don't tell me that you really care about the babies when you really do nothing other than not vote for a Democrat. Like, if you think that there's a genocide going on and your response is simply, I won't vote for a Democrat, I think you may have misunderstood the calling that you should be a part of, right? So there's always a hero narrative, always a victim narrative, and then always a villain. And so that's one of the things we're trying to overcome. We don't want to talk about Republicans only as villains. Rather, we're all sojourners. We're all human sojourners. The alternative to the villain, victim, hero story is that we're all sojourners trying to find our way home at night. And we're trying to get along here. We're trying to live in a way of human flourishing, and we're in this thing together. And if we could and that means we're going to do things that harm one another and things that which some people think are heroic and other people think are villainous, but we're not just that. We're sojourners in this thing together. That's Jesus-y. That's what we do. And so some people want to vote. Some people don't want to vote. We don't tell people to vote or not to vote. We're just like, if you do, make sure the common good's what you're voting about, and if you don't feel good about it, then don't do it.
What's your website?
Your God and your doctor.
Yeah. What's your website? If people are interested or want to check it out, where do they go?
Yeah. Vote Common Good's the thing to look at. If you go to, if you want a good old fashioned website, we're .com, votecommongood.com. You Google Vote Common Good, you'll see all the stuff, the Instagrams and Twitters and all that stuff. It's all under that banner, Vote Common Good. And we do a lot, man. It's a small but mighty little group of activists. And if this is the space where you find yourself in, we run a podcast and YouTube channels and, just all manner of trying to create a context for people so they feel like there's something they could be involved in.
Cool. Well, we are over time, out of time.
We spent 2 hours doing this.
I know, man.
We didn't record all of it, but
Thanks for your time. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to finally connect and get to know you. And I've known of you for so many years, but finally connect is fun. I really appreciate it. So,
that's
folks,
thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So, everybody, thanks for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.